This is our mini lecture on example 1.24 from Analyzing Classical Form. My expectation is that you have a printout on which to take notes and that you have already listened to this example numerous times so that you see the notation and you hear the music. In this excerpt, we will primarily be looking at sequential progressions. Specifically, the sequential progression that it moves by descending thirds. And Kaplan talks about this in the book on pages 21 and 22. You will also want to study example 1.19c because that is the excerpt similar to, identical, not just similar but identical except for the key, that we will be recognizing in this excerpt. We are also going to discuss modulation and, as another topic altogether, what Kaplan calls retrospective reinterpretation. He talks about that on page 92. Of course, we haven't read that far in the book yet. That's next week, but we'll get a start on this topic. Start with the fact this is in the key of G. I do see two C sharps, and looks like a cadence in the key of D, but we're starting in the key of G major. So I spell my G major scale. It's also handy, however, if you have the page thinking a key nearby. Because there are C sharps that move out to D, I am going to spell the 5-letter string of pitches that have the dominant function chords out to D. To begin with, I want to do a standard Roman numeral analysis. So, G, B, and B in the melody, that's just the root and the third. There's no reason not to think that that's not a 1 chord. F sharp, A, D, there's our 5 chord in first inversion. E, G, G, that's just a root and a third. Probably a 6, it could be a 4 in first inversion, missing its C as a root. More than likely it's the 6 because 6 can follow 5, 4 doesn't usually follow 5. D, F sharp, B. In the key of G major, B is a 3 chord. This is in first inversion. C, E, E, there's a 4 chord. B, D, G, a 1, 6. D, F sharp, A, a root position 5 chord. G, G, B, and the 1 chord. We'll stop there at the moment. We have this recurring motive, dum da da dum da da dum da da dum, that has a neighbor and very specifically also a very identifiable rhythmic motive with that neighbor note. Just looking at measures 1 through 4, notice that we start and return to a 1 chord that is voiced with G in the bass and B in the melody. There is a sense in which measures 1 through 4 have not gone anywhere. And in another sense, they have gone quite far. From 1 to 5, notice that we have the descending bass, G, F sharp, E, D, C, B, and then we tack on the D, G, 5, 1 in the key of G. From 1 to 5 is root movement down by 4th or up by 5th. I tend to count root movement down. From the root of a 1 chord to the root of the 5 chord. 1, 7, 6, 5. So that's down by 5th. From the root of the 5 chord to the root of the 6 chord. 5 to 6. That's up by step. So I put a 2. From 6 to 3. 6, 5, 4, 3. Sorry, That should be a 4. This is another down by fourth. From 3 to 4, from the root of the 3 chord to the root of the 4 chord. This is up by step. From the root of the 4 chord to the root of the 1 chord, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's down a fourth. From the root of the 1 chord to the root of the 5 chord, that's down a fourth. And then from the root of the 5 chord to the root of the 1 chord, that's down by fifth. And that's the 5-1 cadence. While speaking of this is going to be an imperfect, authentic cadence because the melody ends on scale degree 3, even though tonic is in the bass. Tonic scale degree is in the bass. So going back and looking at this sequence of harmonies, down by fourth, up by step, down by fourth, up by step, down by fourth, and it breaks when we return to a 1-6, or when we arrive on 1-6, when we return to the tonic. So 1, 5, 6, 6, 3, 6, 4, 1, 6. The 5, 6 through the 4 are the sequence. According to Kaplan, we label the sequence. He would put it up here. I didn't leave enough space there, so I'll put it out here. You're connecting a 1 to a 1-6. Now, you might be asking, but I thought you said this was a sequence of descending thirds. Yes, it is. Where are the descending thirds? From 1 to 6 to 4. 1 to 6 is a descending third. 6 to 4 is a descending third. There is a sense in which the first inversion chords are passing chords because G passes through F sharp to get to E, which passes through D to get to C, and then we arrive on the 1-6. So this is the sequence that is descending thirds that prolongs the tonic. And this is the same pattern that you find in example 1.19c, though all those examples are notated in the key of C, and we're in the key of G major. One other aspect to look at is the interval between the lowest note and the highest note. So from G up to B, if they were close together, it would be a third, but since it's a compound interval, we're going to call that a 10. When we're looking at intervals, when we're analyzing intervals, we never use we typically don't use a number larger than 10. 10 we reserve for some kind of compound third. If it's a true third, line to line, space to space, we use the number 3. Moving on, F sharp to D, that is a 6th. E to G, that's that compound third, we label a 10th. D to B, that is a 6th. C to E, that's our compound third, we label a 10th. B to G, and that's our 6th, and that was our arrival on 1-6. D to A, 5. G to B is our compound third, we label a 10th. You can see a recurring pattern of 10, 6, 10, 6, 10, 6. And then as we approach the imperfect authentic cadence, it changes to 5, 10. So it's a little bit obvious that we have a sequence here because the interval pattern repeats. Some people will call, instead of calling these sequential progressions, they will call them linear intervallic patterns or lips. So we have now thoroughly discussed measures 1 through 4. Now, continuing on into measures 5, 6, 7, and 8. We mentioned earlier that measures 7 and 8 cadence in the key of D major. In fact, this looks like a perfect authentic cadence in D major. A, D, C sharp, D. Measure 5 is an exact repetition of measure 1. Measure 6 melodically begins similarly G, A, G. But it's now the octave above, not the octave below. So as we looked at in our previous example, this is an instance of register transfer. The other term could be octave displacement. So measure 5 is exactly the same as measure 1. Measure 6 has our first instance of a C sharp. This is no longer equivalent to measure 2, even though it begins the same with the sequence. There's two different ways of analyzing this modulation. One way is the most common, which is that pivot chord modulation. It can also be understood as a sequential modulation because we're using the sequence in order to facilitate the modulation. I am going to label it and analyze it as a pivot modulation because it's not a great example of a sequential modulation, though some people would call it that. So we know that measure 5, being a repetition of measure 1, starts off 1 and 5, 6. We also know that we're moving over to the key of D. 5, 6 is our new, it's going to become the new tonic. This is D major will no longer be the dominant, but will be its own tonic. Measure 6 has the first instance of the C sharp. That downbeat of measure 6 is the location of what is known as the significant accidental. The significant accidental is most often the leading tone to the new tonic. C sharp is the leading tone to D. We're modulating to D major. In terms of D major, E, C sharp, and G, C sharp, E, G, that is our leading tone triad to the key of D. So in terms of D, this is the 7 diminished in first inversion going out to D major, which as long as we're still analyzing in the key of G, that's the 5. If you didn't already know for certain that this was going to be a modulation, you would continue analyzing in terms of the original home key. Measure 7, G, B, and E. Well, in the terms of G major, that is a 6 chord in first inversion. A, C sharp, E, ah. That is our 5 of 5. Now, generally, and again, these are guidelines, these are not hard and fast rules, generally, one instance of a secondary leading tone, whether it be in a 5 chord, a diminished triad, the 5/7, or a fully diminished 7th chord. One instance we generally just think of as a secondary chord. The 5 of something, the 7 diminished of something, the way that I've labeled it here. But we have 2 instances of the C sharp, and this is clearly a perfect authentic cadence. A, D, C sharp, D, in the key of D major. So I really want to label this as a modulation. Generally, we look at a modulation as more than one instance of the significant accidental and a cadence in the new key. So pivot chord, pivot modulation, I'm looking for the chord that is diatonic in my old key and my new key, and that chord, the pivot chord, must precede the first instance of the significant accidental. I'll repeat that. The pivot chord, which is diatonic in the home key and the new key, will precede the first instance of the significant accidental. The significant accidental is C sharp. It is in measure 6. I move before that. Here is the D major chord. We labeled it correctly 5/6 in terms of G. In terms of modulating to D major, that now becomes 1/6. And these are the 2 harmonies that we put around the stair step. And now I label the new key. So moving forward, this this D major chord, first inversion, F sharp in the bass, 1/6, C sharp, E, G. That is the 7 diminished first inversion, moving out to a 1 chord in the key of D major. E, G, B is no longer 6, but it's 2. Ah, this is starting to look familiar. 2, 6, 5, 1. Perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. Our cadence here is 1, 2, 6, 5, 1. So far we're good. Actually very good. If you turn to this in like this, great. Here's the reality. At this tempo, measure 9 will have a repetition of measure 1. So that if we're only looking at measures 1 through 8, and we don't know what's happening in measure 9, we're going to say, oh, we had a very nice pivot modulation to the dominant. Very much expected. Tonic, major tonic, first choice of modulation is to the dominant. Knowing that measure 9 is going to be a repetition of measure 1, and restart a repetition of this entire 8 measures. We are going to do a retrospective reinterpretation of this perfect authentic cadence and call it a half cadence in terms of G major. So a retrospective reinterpretation. Retrospective means not in the moment, but after the fact. So that as this excerpt, if you were to continue listening, it would be after hearing measure 9 and moving forward that you would retrospectively reinterpret the modulation, the perfect authentic cadence in D major, as really a half cadence in G major. We'll study more about retrospective reinterpretation as we move into chapters 2 and 3 and beyond. So as a review, we studied this excerpt for its sequential progression that was descending thirds. We also studied this excerpt as having a modulation which on a very local scale can be a pivot modulation. Some would also call it a sequential modulation because it occurs as part of the sequence of this motive. And then we looked at retrospective reinterpretation of the perfect authentic cadence in the dominant as being a half cadence in terms of our tonic G major. We also studied the sequential progression of descending thirds as a linear intervallic pattern. Kaplan doesn't use this term, and in fact he in the textbook does not label the interval between the outer voice that are the featured characteristics of sequential progressions. I like to label the interval between the lowest voice and typically it's the highest voice that create the linear intervallic pattern because it's very obvious to see when you start having recurring numbers. A little bit easier to see than just with the Roman numerals. And in fact, linear intervallic patterns, sequential progressions, Kaplan mentions this just a little bit, doesn't go into great detail on it. When your Roman numerals start getting a little funky, that's the clue that this might be a sequential progression. It might be a linear intervallic pattern. And of course, in this context, we don't use 3 all that often, the diatonic 3 in a major key. So that is the summary of example 1.24.